Welcome to the Den of Dissent. This is a show where we challenge the current culture and mainstream talking points of the day. What is the news telling us? What is the culture telling us? Where is our civilization headed? And by what standard do we judge these issues? Do you agree or do you dissent? Let's find out. Welcome back to the show, people. The Den of Dissent is live. I changed the name to the Den of Dissent instead of the Den of Dissidents because the word dissident is just complicated. So let's just keep it simple. The Den of Dissent, that's the name of the show. Anyway, before I get into the show, I want to talk about autonomy. Autonomy is a course developed by Richard Grove. Richard Grove is a forensic historian. He teaches entrepreneurship skills in this course, autonomy, but it's very unique because he teaches entrepreneurship from an ethical perspective. He's teaching people how to become ethical entrepreneurs, conscious entrepreneurs, because he believes that the world has been hijacked by some wicked people who have gained resources and have used those resources to destroy the world. So that's why he's teaching people how to gain skills and resources to do good with those resources and skills that they gain. Now, the reason why autonomy is so unique is because Richard does these lectures where he's teaching people how they were indoctrinated through the schooling system and gives you some history on the schooling system and how people were dumbed down, indoctrinated, and for what purpose, and who did the dumbing down, who were the players behind doing the dumbing down. And so if you want to go down those rabbit holes, you certainly can, but you will also learn about how to become self-reliant, how to communicate effectively, how to do ethical sales and become an ethical entrepreneur. Also, autonomy teaches or has courses on farming. If you want to learn about how to grow your own food, you want to learn about logic, rhetoric, grammar, finance, how money works, philosophy, on and on it goes. Community building. There's a community of like-minded people in autonomy that you can interact with, you can trade ideas with, build businesses with, etc. There's just so much. It really is a university in the truest sense of the word. So check out autonomy. Oh, last thing. Richard Grove does have a podcast called Grand Theft World, which is a play on words. You think of Grand Theft Auto when people steal cars. Well, he calls his podcast Grand Theft World because he believes that the world has been stolen. It's been hijacked. And his podcast is jam-packed with deep dives, tons of information. I mean, you're talking about a 6-hour, 7-hour podcast. It's crazy. You won't be a dummy after listening to his show. I guarantee that. Anyway, go check it out. I'll post links below and let's get into the show. So today I interviewed Teach'em Chuck and we talk about Malcolm X today. And I'm going to play this clip real quick and give my 2 cents and then we'll just jump right into it.
I've said this 1,000 times, and this is why I'm going into it now. This is why I'm breaking this down. Because the plight of a lot of African countries have nothing at all to do with the legacy of colonialism, just like your condition, black folk, has nothing to do with the legacy of slavery. It has everything to do with the ideology and the worldview that you embrace today. Africa destroyed itself because Africa went full-blown socialist after the various nationalist revolutions that threw off their colonial rulers. Africa is suffering due to the legacy of colonialism, right? I got it. It's the white man, right? No, the white man showed you how to build a prosperous nation, how to build a prosperous society, and you flung it off to the side because you looked at it as though, yes, it's coming from the white man. It's not coming from the white man. It's coming from a man who just so happens to be white. Why are you throwing out the baby with the bathwater? Don't you want freedom? Don't you like freedom? No, you would rather be a socialist. Why? Because the white man gave you the concept of individualism and capitalism, and you don't want it because the white man is the one that gave it to you. But what's the alternative? Socialism? Oh, you want that because the black man is going to give you that. Well, I don't want that shit. Does that make me a sellout and a coon and etc.? I'll be that, and I'll wear that shit proudly. You ain't hurting my feelings. I don't give a damn what you say. I'm not a fool.
The man said he is not a fool. So, you heard what he said. He said the white man was teaching you how to build. He gave you capitalism. He gave you freedom in these things. And he said the black man was giving you socialism. And you rather take socialism from the black man instead of capitalism from the white man. And he's talking about colonialization in Africa. And yeah, I know that sounds crazy to some people. Now, I don't like to generalize or anything like that. But anyway, we talked about Malcolm X. We get into his ideology and how destructive it was. And I'll just say this before I get into the show. When I was growing up, I went to go see the Malcolm X movie by Spike Lee. And I had a lot of admiration for Malcolm X because he was very stern. He was firm. He was articulate. And I was a kid. I didn't know too much about his ideology. But as I got older, started digging in, I saw some alarming things, some very surprising things about what he thought. And so we will get into that. Also, it's funny when you look at some of these historical figures. I think now we have to rethink what these people were teaching, really, and compare and contrast these ideologies to biblical ideas and what God thinks of these things, really. And one example I could think of is Che Guevara, because Malcolm X was very influential. He was a notable figure in hip hop as well. And so when you think of guys like Che Guevara, Jay-Z was wearing the Che Guevara shirt. And I remember Che Guevara became popular in high school because Jay-Z wore a shirt with his face on it. So you had all these young kids wearing shirts with Che Guevara. Meanwhile, Cuban people would look at that and be very offended because they felt that Che Guevara was like just a murderous tyrant, pretty much. And, hip hop kids didn't know anything about that. So that's why I say sometimes we need to rethink who we're supporting, look into these ideologies and find out what they're really about and just get to the root and the bottom of them. But on that note, check out the show. Let me know what you think. I will post links to Autonomy. I'll post the Cash App link if you want to support the show. And on that note, let's get started. Welcome back to the Den of Dissent. Today, I have special guest, Teach 'em Chuck. He's host of Teach 'em Chuck. He has his own YouTube channel, and he's a co-host of Cutting Through the Culture. Teach 'em Chuck gets into the deep roots of different ideologies like Marxism, communism. He talks about BLM, the Black Panthers, even goes into Obama's ideology as well, and shows you how destructive these ideologies are. And he does it with a very surgical, sharp, and aggressive style. Welcome to the show, Chuck.
What up, man? How you feeling, brother? How you feeling?
Blessed, man. Blessed. Thank you for coming on today, man.
It is a blessing. Thank you for having me, man. I couldn't wait to come back on your show, bro. You really do a good job.
Thanks.
Researching and you know the right questions to ask and really how to facilitate a very fruitful conversation, man, from the last time I appeared on your show. So I'm just glad to be back, man.
Thanks, man. We definitely got to have these conversations because a lot of these topics weren't really explored the way I would like them to be explored, especially when I was growing up. But
True that.
Looking at your channel, you're really just exposing a lot of the falsehoods and showing how a lot of these ideologies are flawed. But today I was looking at some of your videos on Malcolm X. I saw a recent show you did with Sub-Zero talking about Marxism and hip hop. And there was another video I watched on the Black Panthers. Now, growing up, both of us, we grew up listening to a lot of hip hop, especially conscious hip hop. And Malcolm X was very influential, I would say, with a lot of hip hop artists. You think about Public Enemy and X-Clan, even Nas, Gangstar, all these guys.
And Brand Nubian.
Yeah, man. So when I saw your video about Malcolm, you really went deep into his ideology. And first, I wanted to talk about you get into the Nation of Islam and you talk about Elijah Muhammad and his worldview. And you talk about how Malcolm was promoting Marxism. Talk a little bit about how the Nation of Islam, what their worldview really was, and the Marxism that Malcolm X was promoting.
hmm Well, it's funny that you mentioned that video that I have on my YouTube channel about Malcolm X, because I really dealt with Malcolm post his, I guess, separation from the Nation of Islam, from the time he made his Hajj in 1964. I can't remember the exact month or day, but it was during that year, and he would be assassinated not even a full year after that, and early in 1965. And so that's what I wanted to deal with, because a lot of people believe that, especially, people who are conservative, consider themselves to be, politically conservative like you and I, they talk about how, Malcolm, especially when it comes to this compare and contrast between Malcolm and Martin, now that a lot of details regarding MLK is starting to resurface, not surface, but resurface, because these are things that were well known before, popular media in our educational system did much to subdue or bury these details about MLK. Now that you are seeing some conservatives begin to outright turn their backs on MLK, or to at least question his legacy, now they're leaning more heavily into Malcolm X, because they're saying, well, Malcolm X had the way, because Malcolm X stressed, personal agency and accountability, and most importantly, Malcolm X warned blacks about the treachery of the white liberal. Right. And this is a very popular talking point amongst conservatives today, black and white, about the treachery and the duplicity of the white liberal. I think, of course, Malcolm X once famously referred to white liberals as the most dangerous creature in the Western Hemisphere, or something to that effect. And so now you're hearing this, well, Malcolm X, he was right. He had the right idea, especially once he separated himself from the racist attitudes of the Nation of Islam, is when you began to see Malcolm sort of mature. And unfortunately, we never got a chance to see what Malcolm was going to, or could have become, because he was going to bring us all together. And what I did in that video is I went in to sort of dispel that myth. What you had with with Malcolm X, when he separated from the Nation of Islam, is you began to see him embrace, first and foremost, that he rejected the unorthodox teachings of Islam, which, speaking of the Nation of Islam as a whole, from an ideological point of view, is rooted in a lot of Eastern mysticism, and a lot of these various esoteric sciences. And a lot of it, again, when you're speaking about the founding of the Nation of Islam, its founder, Wallace Farad Muhammad, it's not exactly, at least from my research, I haven't found anything concise or precise yet, sort of pointing to Wallace D. Farad Muhammad's association with the Moorish Science Temple and Noble Drew Ali, but much of the Nation of Islam's foundational texts and teachings come out of the esoteric and Masonic and other occult influences. It comes out of the teachings of Timothy Drew. And so when Malcolm sort of separated himself from these ideas, he embraced a more orthodox interpretation of the Quran, because even Malcolm says himself, even when you read the autobiography of Malcolm X, which is, of course, I guess, considered to be sort of like the seminal text regarding Malcolm X and his life as expressed in his own words, and with the help of Alex Haley, of course, he talks about how he had no clue that much of what Elijah Muhammad had taught him about Islam and the Quran was I guess, blasphemous in the minds of the sort of wider Muslim population outside of the United States. For example, even the autobiography of Malcolm X, so Malcolm talks about one of the key things that he found shocking to him was to see how many Muslims rejected this idea that the white man was, of course, created by a character called
Yakub.
Dr. Yakub, right? And so, he took up Islam. I think he became Sunni, if I'm not mistaken, from memory, and he really sort of began to embrace politics more, and that was another key reason, aside from, a lot of the we know about the dirty dealings, if you will, of the honorable Elijah Muhammad. But even Malcolm said himself in his own words, and we have him recorded as having said that even in the the wake of these revelations, that Malcolm would not have chosen on his own volition to leave the Nation of Islam. He was ran out, essentially. He never wanted to leave. But another part of the reason why there was this huge split was, of course, because behind the scenes and on the surface, because we saw Malcolm publicly reprimanded by the nation, because Malcolm wanted the Nation of Islam to become more politically active. He wanted them to take a more a more overt political stance, because he says that we can't keep talking all this stuff about the way blacks are being treated in the United States and in the world over, for that matter. We can't continue to harp on it without actually sort of, I guess, doing something about it, or getting involved in the political process. And so, and Malcolm would, of course, do and say things that went contrary to the orders that he was being given. Of course, we all remember the infamous moment when he made the chickens coming home to roost comment with regard to the assassination of JFK. And so when Malcolm left the nation, what he then began to embrace more so was, these far left Marxist politics.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what I think a lot of people, particularly on the conservative side of the political spectrum, they either don't know about, or they simply choose to ignore, for what reason, I don't know exactly. But Malcolm X was in fact a leftist through and through. Make no mistake about it. And before I give the floor back to you, so you can kind of comment or ask another question, I know you asked about just the Nation of Islam in general in their Marxian ideas. Because you have to understand that in the 1920s and 1930s, there was this multi well, not so much. When I say multi-ethnic, I don't mean that. I mean, yes, certain groups were multi-ethnic, but when I say multi-ethnic, I mean you had black groups and white groups in the United States embracing this new age movement of the 1920s, which, again, you don't hear about, because a lot of historians, when they talk about American history from a cultural point of view, they don't bring up this particular era. And it really began in the late 19th century, and it really came to a head with the countercultural movement of the 1960s, but in the 1920s and 1930s. And this was, of course, around the time when the Moorish Science Temple was founded, and then later the Nation of Islam was founded in 1930 in my home city of Detroit. You began to see this coupling once again with these sort of new age Aquarian ideas with the more political, or should I say, Black liberationism that was popular at that time, and, which was made popular during that time by the likes of men like Marcus Garvey and W.E.B. Du Bois, these kind of co-founders, if you will, of Pan-Africanism. And so what you had in Noble Drew Ali and W.D. Farad, or Wallace Farad Muhammad, is this kind of coupling of this kind of this sense of liberation, this kind of political emancipation
Mm-hmm.
from the leftover shackles of imperialism and slavery and all these things, with these other more mythological, esoteric ideas regarding, I guess, sort of like the Black man and his relationship to the wider society. And so
Mm-hmm.
you had to kind of create these myths and whatnot in order to facilitate this political emancipation. And you even hear it in the rhetoric of just not just Malcolm X, but just the Nation of Islam in general, because if you know anything about the Nation of Islam's doctrine, it is a very material based. It is a very earthly kind of doctrine. There's almost nothing spiritual about it.
Mm. Um, when you talk about the Nation of Islam, it sounds like you were saying that they borrowed from Masonic and Eastern mysticism
Yeah,
religions. Would you say that they promote a lot of self worship? And I ask that because when I was growing up listening to hip hop and hearing a lot of, listening to Wu Tang in particular and
yeah,
some of these
yeah,
five percenters,
yeah.
they would refer to themselves as gods. And I hear this, I've heard this amongst guys in the Nation of Islam, peace God, you are God. And would you say that
Yeah.
that's promoting self worship in a sense?
Absolutely, absolutely. And me probably, I full disclosure, man, I'm a big Wu Tang, or was a big Wu Tang fan. One of my favorite artists of all time is, Raekwon. Because for me, arguably, only Big for Cuban Links is the greatest hip hop album ever made, and so Raekwon always has a fond place in my heart. And I can be honest, man. I mean, I can listen to that album from front to back every now and again, man. If I find myself at work and I'm hustling and bustling and I just want to live, I may put the album on and just let it play. So yeah, yeah, Wu Tang Clan, of course, big time five percenters. Even the late old dirty bastard, God rest his soul. His older brother. Those of you again, if you're familiar with the Wu Tang Clan's albums, you'll hear a guy is kind of giving, I want to say, like sermons, if you will,
Papa
on
Wu?
their albums. Papa Wu, doing a lot of talking and things
Right.
like that. And Papa Wu is, I believe, Old Dirty Bastard's older brother. And Papa Wu, I forget his real name, has connections of sorts with, in friendship and in business with one of the, I guess, kind of civil rights leaders who, kind of goes underneath the radar. And that's because, certain legal issues he found himself involved in. I think he was convicted of kidnapping and received a 7-year prison sentence. And that is a man by the name of Sonny Carson, who was also the biological father of Professor X, who was one of the founding members of X Clan.
Mm.
And we may get into Sonny Carson throughout the conversation as well. But anywho, yeah. So you had the Wu Tang Clan. Rakim, of course, was a five percenter. Another one of my Mount Rushmore rappers, one of my favorite all time rappers, was Big Daddy Kane. He was another five percenter.
Yeah.
I liked a Brand Nubian. Yeah, their album All for One. I still bump it to this day with Sadat X and Grand Pubar, Lord Jamar, a guy who is become, somewhat of a social media kind of influencer personality kind of person now. I even see conservatives, especially, those conservatives that are of our ilk, they send me sound bites and clips and things like that Lord
Mm.
Jamar says, because he's was speaking out, I guess, against the poke, if you will, and
Yeah.
the whole pandemic situation. And so, oh, Lord Jamar, look at what he's
Right.
kind of like on our side or whatever. But
Yeah.
anyway, so yes, this whole notion that the black man is is God. Part of this whole theosophical movement, I call it Black Theosophy, but just theosophy in general, or New Thought and Metaphysics, the New Age movement. Again, you kind of split hairs when you're using all of these different terms. These terms, they had different names during different periods. Uh, as I mentioned, going back to the 1800s, you had certain individuals, figures, such as a man by the name of Phineas Parkhurst Quimby. You had the founder of Christian Science, a woman by the name of Mary Baker Edie. You had a woman by the name of Madame Helena Blavatsky. who quote unquote discovered Judah Krishnamurti, and all these sorts of individuals. And there's a whole slew of these kind of characters in the 1920s. You had the guys like Sweet Daddy Grace. I remember forgot the other gentleman. He was a black man, very, very powerful. Like I say, most people refer to him as a cult leader.
Mm-hmm.
I forget his name. It may come to me. You had the I Am movement with Guy Ballard and his wife. Scientology. A guy like L. Ron Hubbard was in the background at this
Mm-hmm.
time. And so you kind of had all this stuff going on. But my point in saying all of this, and I'm of course we don't have time to really get into a lot of details to iron these things out. But my point is, all of them share one thing in common, and that is this attempt at subduing or usurping the authority of the God of the Bible, the God of the Trinity, and giving that authority to man. Because you, of course, had two, if we can break it up in a binary of sorts, of course, you have the exoteric spiritual expression and you have the esoteric. And the exoteric, right, is this, or say, for example, like this not, we hear the term a Gnostic, which is like salvation through knowledge, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in order to, I guess, gain the knowledge of the gods, quote unquote, one has to be initiated, if you will, into the ancient mysteries.
Mm.
And when you become initiated into the ancient mysteries, what you will find is that the keys, if you will, of the knowledge of God is within, and not in terms of knowledge that I myself am a fallen creature, I'm a sinner, and this and that, and I have to hand my sins over to God and accept the gift of salvation and try my best as a sinner to live a decent life. That's not what they mean. That is the exoteric, because that, and you can kind of see when you think about attitudes and sentiments, like Charles Spencer and Karl Marx, when they would Karl Marx would say that religion is the sigh of the oppressed. Christianity is the opiate, or as we would say by today's standards, we would call it opium, the opium of the masses. Like I said, Marx would use the term opiate.
Mm-hmm.
But there you have this belief, whether it's just outward hostility or whether it's kind of subdued and subliminal, is that the exoteric, the outer, is the sort of illusion kind of meant to keep the non-initiated complacent and on the outside of this sort of true power. And the true power, in a nutshell, is the reality from their point of view that we as human beings are in fact the God that we seek. And if we can unlock this understanding, then we can become better people, and as a result create a better world.
Yeah.
And
Go ahead.
so Rashad, it kind of in the minds of the 5%ers and the Clarion X's and that whole strand of it, it kind of builds on this idea that that the black man is, of course, the original man, right? And so everything that exists in society as a whole runs a downstream from all of the original man's achievements.
Yeah.
And that is true in the way of spirituality as well. And so this is why the black man is seen as a superior man in this way, because nothing would exist without him, because he was the first man. And if you know anything about the Nation of Islam and the teachings of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and you even hear it in the lyrics of the 5%ers, the rappers like Brand Nubian and so on and so forth, that they want you to believe that Jesus is coming back. They want you to believe in a spook in the sky. Remember the message to the black man, Elijah Muhammad's magnum opus, where he says that Of course, that Christianity is the white man religion, but in the white man's own admission, he claims that his God is the spirit, that his God is somewhat unknown. And so, how can the white man teach you about God when he himself admits that he does not know God because his God is a spirit? Well,
Mm,
Elijah Muhammad says that I, as the messenger, I have come to deliver a message. That is, that God is what they say, a true and living man. He is not a spook in the sky. I met Allah in the form of Wallace Muhammad. God is not a spirit, God is a man. And seeing as how the original man is a black man, if you are made in the likeness of his image, then God too must be black.
yeah.
And so hence you have this kind of racial
Hmm.
superiority narrative is the foundation of
Yeah.
this kind of teaching.
Yeah, like you said, because throughout the years, when listening to some of the artists that we used to listen to, they did talk a lot about, especially Papa Wu. He was, talk about how the black man is God and the father of civilization, cream of the crop, and and the master builder and
Right.
all of this. And
Yeah.
earlier when you said these the philosophy of the Nation of Islam is kind of based on Masonic ancient mystery religions and Eastern mysticism. I think Eric Mason, who's a Christian pastor who talks about some of these, I think he calls them black cults. He
Mhm.
says that
What's
they're
what's his name again?
Eric Mason. He has a
Okay.
book called Urban Apologetics, and he goes into the NOI, he goes into Hebrew Israelites, all that. And but
Eric
from
Mason, I'm gonna check him out. I don't think I've ever heard his
yeah,
name before. Check
um,
him out. Okay.
but he's saying
Black
that
cults.
urban
What's it
apologetics,
called? Urban apologetics.
yeah,
Okay, that's the name of the book.
yeah.
Okay.
So he
Okay.
yeah, he says that a lot of these philosophies that these black religions are basing their worldview on is coming from white people, pretty
Yeah,
much.
it is.
So,
Yeah.
on one hand, they're lashing out and talking about white supremacy and how the white man is the devil, but the philosophy itself is being borrowed from white people like Blavatsky, like you said, and others, which I just find that interesting. But it is a form of self-worship. You're saying the black man is God and I'm the master builder and I can do this. I mean, that was the message that was promoted. There's a lot of self reliance in that, but at the same time, it
Yeah.
is self worship. Moving on a little
Yeah.
bit, I wanted to get into Malcolm, but before that, in your video on Malcolm, you talked about the Nation of Islam and Scientology and how some guys in the nation were moving away from the nation because they saw that I think
Yeah.
Farrakhan was starting to lean towards Scientology. Can you touch on that a little
Yeah.
bit?
Yeah, well, I've over the years, in fact, and it's funny because in that video, I said it in a tongue-in-cheek way, but I was being honest because I mean it's literally out there, it literally exists. The actress Leah Remini, who famous, she's most known for her role as Carrie Heffernan on the sitcom King of Queens. Of course, she was doing her whole kind of crusade, if you will, against the Church of Scientology, which she was, of course, a member of um, for most of her life, and she rejected it and whatever. Even know her whole story by heart, but pretty sure all of you are familiar with who she is in that whole series, docu series that she had. Um, allowing ex Scientologists to tell their horror stories. Well, I guess this this series, and I think it ran on A&E for some time. Um, she had she was getting contacted by other, I guess, people who were like former members of cults, as they would describe it. And two in particular there was a lot of Jehovah Witnesses reaching out to her, and then you had some members, those who were members of the Nation of Islam, reaching out to her, and on her show. She actually spoke. I think it was maybe two or three black guys who were noticing a troubling trend within the Nation of Islam of Farrakhan, and Farrakhan, his word is essentially um, his word is law, essentially. And so I'm not making this up. I mean, I'm pretty sure, it does, you don't have to be a master researcher. You can just simply do a basic Google search on or YouTube search. You can find clips of Minister Farrakhan saying glowing things about L. Ron Hubbard, and talking openly about how it is time for the Nation of Islam to begin to embrace Dianetics
Mm,
and the teachings of Scientology. Again, just knowing just some of the basic fundamentals of Scientology, like we're talking about, there is a lot of psychological and psychiatric kind of quackery, and a lot of other UFOlogy and things of that nature mixed in. And of course, with the Nation of Islam, their foundational texts, and the text involves a lot of UFOlogy, the same way in which the Church of Scientology embraces a lot of this, extraterrestrial kind of mythology and things of that nature. But yes, it's not something that that one has to do a whole a bunch of research into to get to the bottom of. I mean, it's somewhat open at this point. I don't exactly know, far as financially, or even a ton as far as like philosophy is concerned or ideology is concerned, where you're starting to see, I guess, this mix or this crossover between the two. But there has been a lot of former Nation of Islam members speaking out against Scientology's encroachment into their organization. Of course, they're saying to themselves, well, these majority, or it's this thing that was started by this white guy, and so we're being told one thing, and then on the other hand, but to
yeah.
your point, unbeknownst to them, there there lies, I guess, a deep similarities between those two organizations, from a doctrinal point of view, not just in terms of Minister Farrakhan's overtures and his open embrace of L. Ron Hubbard. There is this, uh, I guess, a core value that they have in common, which is that man is at the center
Mm,
of everything,
yeah.
and not God.
Mm, interesting. Getting back to Malcolm a little bit, in your video, you mentioned how Malcolm, towards the end of his life, and when I saw the Malcolm X movie, I remember at one point I said, if Malcolm would have lived longer, he probably would have converted to Christianity. But after hearing your video, yeah, I kind of like discarded that idea. But a lot of people say, well, Malcolm was coming to the truth towards the end of his life, and this is why he broke with the Nation of Islam, and he started to see that there were Muslims that were white when he went to the East. And
Hmm.
you're saying that he started to get involved with Pan-Africanism, and he wanted to become international in terms of his pursuits for the struggle of justice, because he saw that
Hmm.
the black struggle was beyond America's borders. It was international now.
Hmm.
Um, Talk about why that's problematic. Why Malcolm, when he changed, when he was evolving, his
Hmm.
evolution was problematic in terms of the
Hmm.
internationalism.
Right. Well, you have to think that, of course, that the cause of communism is international, and that workers of the world unite. Right. I mean, that is how Karl Marx ends the Communist Manifestation or Communist Confession of Faith, i.e., the Communist Manifesto, that the workers of the world must unite. When Vladimir Lenin would become the first leader of a Soviet Russia, I mean, even beforehand, I mean, he was a known figure. He wrote under the pseudonym V.I. Lenin. That wasn't his born name, but that was his pseudonym, and as a result, that's the name, yeah, that he embraced. And he went on to be known as Vladimir Lenin. But he wrote a piece, because he would pretty much take Marxist theories, and he would create. I guess he would sort of I don't necessarily want to say politicize them, but he would create, I guess, the game plan, the schema, if you will, in terms of how we're going to implement Karl Marx's ideas. And as an aside, these weren't just Karl Marx's ideas. There were a ton of other men who were involved in the creation and the proliferation of communism, not just Marx and Engels. You had, of course, Mikhail Bakunin, and many others who weren't, in fact, economists or social theorists. A lot of these men considered themselves to be theologians, albeit unorthodox, but these men were theologians nonetheless. Other men such as Bruno Bauer, who was a somewhat of a mentor and a close friend of Karl Marx up to a point, because Karl Marx would almost run afoul of every friend that he ever had. But you had Bruno Bauer and Ludwig Feuerbach, another theologian by the name of David Strauss, who had a very heavy influence on Karl Marx and the way he thought. Others, the so-called father of communist Zionism, a man by the name of Moses Hess, another leftist theoretician who was a contemporary of Marx. So I'm just throwing all these names out so you guys can go and research these men on your own time. Another man by the name of Pierre Joseph Proudhon. He was another associate of Marx to a point, and then of course they would eventually fall out. But so, like I said, it wasn't just Karl Marx, himself. I know that for the sake of prudence, for the sake of time, we just simply say Marxism, but he isn't the one who created it all on his own. There were a lot of other thinkers, contemporaries at the time, and of course, goes back to Friedrich Hegel. And everything again kind of flows downstream from Hegel. This is why Marx and Hegel, I think their first work was titled The German Ideology, because Friedrich Hegel would kind of set Western philosophy on the trend that we see today. We're dealing with the consequences of that trend. And so going back to Malcolm and this idea of him kind of broadening, go back and whenever one has time to just sort of sift through or just read, if you are a reader. Vladimir Lenin wrote a treatise or a book that was released, I think, back in 1916. This was shortly before the Bolshevik Revolution. He wrote a book in 1916 called Imperialism. And Vladimir Lenin's main focus was to try and unpack why there was no, or why the laborers, if you will, in the quote unquote capitalist democracies were not rebelling. What exactly was going on? And to put it in a nutshell, Vladimir Lenin came to the conclusion that these sort of core economic zones were exporting their capital, if you will, to the less fortunate, or the proletariat, if you will, at the periphery of the societies that the property owning classes controlled, i.e., imperialism, in Vladimir Lenin's own words, was capitalism, if you will, at its highest form of development. And so you had laborers or proletarians who had become complacent, if you will, and who had pretty much betrayed the revolution, because they were sort of doing the bidding, if you will, of the bourgeoisie, so long as they weren't the ones that were at the absolute bottom of the totem pole, as compared to, say, the peoples of a quote unquote third world country, who were merely having their raw materials extracted for the purpose of bolstering a heavy industry. And so this is when you begin to see communism as a philosophy embrace this idea that we can now begin to link imperialism and capitalism to one another. Although capitalism, again, which if it ends in the suffix ism, you're not talking about and economic system, which is the free market system, you're talking about an idea. And so the term capitalism is sort of like this pejorative that was created by peoples who were, for whatever reason, against the natural mechanisms of the free market system.
Mm.
And so what you began to see was this coupling, this kind of taking imperialism, because imperialism is nothing fairly new to the human experience. But a true kind of free market system, i.e., capitalism, right? When you're talking about property rights, there are certain underlying principles that have to be understood and accepted by man for them to then go on to accept a free market system of economics. Human beings and societies and empires warring and conquering and annexing other peoples as a result of war or whatever the case may be, i.e., what we would call imperialism. These kinds of mechanisms for society building or empire building were along or were around long before capitalism in its modern form was ever understood. So, I mean, it doesn't take a genius. I mean, I don't have to preach to the choir, Rashad. I don't have to tell you that Vladimir Lenin's theory, if you will, was just completely and utterly preposterous. But this is what the left began to embrace during that period of time. And again, Vladimir Lenin's book, his 1916 book, Imperialism, encapsulates this idea. So when you fast forward to Malcolm, Malcolm began to embrace this international approach, right? This belief that it was imperialism and all of the negative aspects or consequences of imperialism from his point of view that was leading to this global, if you will, inequality. Because if you
Mm.
look at, for example, for as much as Black folks talk about how bad we have it here in the United States, but we as Blacks in the United States live much better than, say, for example, a poorer person or a quote unquote oppressed person in another country. And so the mere existence of inequality anywhere, of course, is an issue
Mm.
to an idealist who embraces this particular point of view. And so Malcolm would go on to say, and he would literally say this, and I can, pull up the quotes, where he says that Black folks ought not look at themselves as an oppressed minority here in the United States, because we, in fact, make up the majority of human beings. If you kind of amalgamate and couple us with all non-white peoples in the world. And so
Mm.
the white population makes up a small population. Hence, we as non-white people must unite with one another for the purpose of pushing back, if you will, the evils of colonialism and imperialism. And that is how we, in fact, affix, if you will, or balance out this asymmetry that exists in the way of economics and
Yeah.
politics, etc.
Mm. Well, it seems like, when you say that I think you mentioned the international, he wanted to threaten the international
Mhm.
power structure. Um,
Right.
when it comes to his style or his worldview, I think you mentioned that he was reading or studying
And Kuma.
Eh, Kwame Nkrumah, who was a
Hmm.
Pan Africanist and who was promoting socialism. Um,
Hmm.
do you think that Malcolm X knew the dangers of socialism and Marxism? Do you think that he would have
Mm.
realized this is a flawed system of government?
I mean, he may have. I mean, of course, there's no way that I can say for sure. It certainly doesn't seem like he knew at the time. You mentioned Kwame Nkrumah, which he was the founder of the Organization for African Unity. Kwame Nkrumah, in fact, wasn't just Malcolm, but Kwame Nkrumah actually met with Dr. King as well. Because Kwame Nkrumah, for whatever reason, he was symbolically the figurehead, if you will, for this anti colonial movement throughout the entire continent of Africa. He again, like I said, for whatever reasons, and Nkrumah had this, and mind you, Nkrumah was an American educated politician, if you will. I think he went to Penn. I'm trying to remember. Anyway, I guess it's not important to go into his academic credentials, but yeah, Kwame Nkrumah was a Western educated man who rose up to become, I guess, Ghana's. I think he was their first president post independence. I think it was the British Empire that had control over Ghana. And so Kwame Nkrumah was a very popular figure. He was beloved by the left because, of course, the rhetoric at the time was, well, we want self-determination. And you had the colonial powers, if you want to call them that, in Europe, who, at that particular point, we're talking after having fought 2 world wars. You can't imagine, or you can't possibly understate the political and economic toll that the Second World War, in particular, had on Great Britain. It pretty much spelled the end of the British Empire, World War II, even though, as part of the Allied forces, they were the victors, if you will, in that war. But Britain would never be the same after that. And men like Kwame Nkrumah was, he was seen as the man holding the banner, taking the mantle, if you will, into battle for the cause of liberation from the tyranny of European colonialism. But what in fact was what was taking place, in fact, was this a mad grab, if you will, between the United States and Soviet Russia for what I guess nuclear equipped superpower would fill the void from what was left behind from Europe's retreat, if you will, from its peripheral territories. And Kwame Nkrumah was a pawn and a stooge, if you will, of the Soviet Union. I can't say for sure that he, literally, like in the case of someone, say, like a Patrice Lumumba, but he was most certainly a revolutionary, a socialist, a Marxist-Leninist. He described himself as such in no uncertain terms and in various writings. And once again, this man was the titular head, the symbolic head of the African independence movement in the mid 20th century. And Malcolm X was very, very fond of Nkrumah. I believe they did meet, of course, Malcolm, after his Hajj, and I think I mentioned this in that YouTube video that you're speaking about. Malcolm X would create the Organization of Afro-American Unity, which was modeled after Kwame Nkrumah's organization. And of course, Nkrumah believed that, all of Africa, if you will, should be united so as to create this almost like this Sovietized super zone, which the Soviet Union, to bring it back to them, they were heavily had a very a vested interest, if you will, in creating what the Soviets themselves, the Comintern in the 1920s. This was right around the time when you had a lot of Jews migrating to the area of Palestine. This was before Israel would be created in 1948. But when you began to see an outbreak in the region of Palestine between Arabs and Arab Muslims and Jews and so forth, the Comintern had this idea of creating what they referred to as a Soviet Arabistan. Mm-hmm. So as to use the event, that particular event in the Middle East as an opportunity to then create almost like this socialist super region in the Middle East as well. You see.
Interesting. So you also talked about how you talked about colonialism
Mhm.
and capitalism. So in that video, you mentioned how Malcolm was, or some of these Pan-Africanists, they were against colonialism
Mhm.
because, it was coming from the white man. And I think you made a quote like, well, the black man doesn't want colonialism because it's coming from the white man. So they'll embrace socialism, which is far worse,
Yeah,
as
right.
long as it's
But
not
still
coming from the
coming
white
from the
man.
white man.
Right. Yeah. And it's still
Right.
coming from the white man.
Yeah, yeah. They'll accept as
But
long as it's not a, and the
well,
strangest thing is,
real quick, because
yeah,
on that point too, you said that Africa is not bad because of colonialism. Africa has been destroyed because of socialism. But
socialism.
the black man doesn't want to embrace the colonialism from the white man, even though it has helped the black man rise and has
Yeah,
given him structure and
yeah,
foundation. Go ahead.
yeah. Well, well, see, because here's the thing. When you're talking about socialism, right, as an economic system, or Marxism as an economic critique, a lot of folks, fail to realize that, when you're talking about economics, you're simply explaining how or you're trying to come up with a way that human beings can coordinate, if you will, the movement of resources based upon the principle of supply and demand, right? We communicate systematically with one another as separate human beings, as separate groups of human beings, vis-a-vis the pricing system. Now, the question then becomes what, in fact, determines the price that is placed upon commodities, right? You have a market system, or you have a market based economy, should I say, or you have a planned economy. And that's what socialism is essentially. It is planned economics versus market economics. The question is, of course, which economic system works better in the way of not only just building wealth, but giving human beings the kind of comfort and access to the things that they want and need. And of course, like I mentioned, I don't mean to just poo poo it, but because building wealth is a part of that. And so my point in saying that, the reason why I preface with that is because when you think about the American Revolution, right? We talk about white people or white society and this and that, and they go on about the United States, the American Revolution, our founding. But what people who criticize it either ignored or too stupid to understand is that the American Revolution, in principle, was the first, I guess, the revolution or an example for all humanity of what a system of the common man, if you will, actually looks like. And that, in fact, is what our constitutional system of checks and balances is all about. The Constitution was created so as to protect the the rights, or should I say, to allow the wisdom of the common man to be kind of brought forth, to allow the wisdom of the common man to flourish at the expense of the self exaltation and self aggrandizement of the self appointed expert, right? Because the constitutional system allows for we, the people, right, to sort of throw off or to protect ourselves from whatever idea is fashionable at the time, or to protect ourselves against the tyranny of any particular group or any particular person who is on the ascendancy, so as not to create a situation where you have everyday folk subjected to the excesses, again, I mentioned, of self appointed rulers or self appointed experts. And so the truth of the matter is that the American founding is this kind of true revolution in the way of this idea of restoring or creating a system where, when they talk about power to the people, no, we the people is our power and our rights and our abilities to do all the things that these socialist, Marxist, communists claim that they want for humanity. All of those things are there in the American founding and in the American tradition. And what our framers and founders understood in all of what I have just said, what is innate in all of that rhetoric there, I don't want rhetoric like I'm trying to downplay what I just said, but what they had come to realize is that they didn't know who, in fact, if anyone was even capable of having a monopoly on right, in the sense that who exactly knows what system is right, as far as when we're talking about ideas now, right? Ideas and also individuals. There is no one individual or one solitary group that has a monopoly on all wisdom. And there is no one idea that can exclusively encapsulate all that is right for eternity, all that which man will ever need, all that which man will ever need to know in order to flourish within his finite life. And so it's kind of like a weird contradiction in a way, because the founders and the framers understood that the only thing that we need to create or should focus ourselves on creating is creating a process that must remain sacrosanct, so as the people going in can properly sort of, I guess, predict, if you will, the behaviors of their fellow man, so as to create some semblance of equality based upon the simple premise that we all go into, right, interaction with one another's knowing the rules. We're not guaranteed to win. We're not guaranteed a specific outcome, but we are at least going in knowing some or having a sense, if you will, of what the rules are.
Yeah.
And so, and I haven't lost you. I didn't forget your question. So when you hence the concept that we are a nation of laws, not a nation of men. We aren't bound by arbitrary edict. We are a nation of laws, right? And in order for us to have justice, if you will, the whole concept, and because only we as human beings can be just, and we express our will collectively through the legislative process, right? When you're talking about law, the law can only interpret the rules, but the law cannot execute, or the law cannot implement justice. Law, from a philosophical point of view, can only properly interpret the rules so as to communicate to the individual what he or she should have did at the time based upon the rules that were already in place. Justice as a concept is expressed through the legislature, not the judiciary, in terms of how we understand justice and freedom and liberty and all of these things. I say all of that to say, right, that when people talk about, well, we should have this, again, this socialist resolution, like you mentioned, as I said in the video, people will accept socialism as long as it's a black man saying it to them versus, say, for example, a white man coming to them and saying, well, you need to embrace free market economics, right? Because the truth of the matter is that even when you're talking about socialism or should I say, what am I trying to say? A socialist type system where you have the powers that be, if you will, at the top, who are setting prices based upon some kind of lofty vision that they have in terms of their ideas of what perfect justice looks like, then they are inevitably going to corrupt the whole of society, because contrary to what or should I say, according to what our founders understood, they understood that no one person, or should I say, small group of individuals, has a monopoly on all requisite wisdom so as to create a society that is perfectly just based upon some lofty preconceived notion. So it doesn't matter if the person is black or if the person is white, it's the same exact consequence, right?
Right.
No matter what.
Mm.
And so imperialism, colonialism is what imparts those ideas to a people who were pre-civilizational. Because these folks talk about the evils of imperialism and colonialism, but they don't talk about the benefits, in that there has never been a time in human history, in recorded history, where a peoples are, I guess, improved, or for lack of better terms, civilized, without there first being a period of imperial subjugation.
Mm.
The revolution in America was an expression on behalf of those folks who initiated the rebellion against the British Crown to say, I too want the rights of an Englishman.
Mm-hmm.
Because it wasn't so much a rejection of the tradition, because our constitutional framers and founders were basing their understanding of our system, the system that they were creating, and they were basing it upon pre-existing notions and practices that were already familiar to the peoples of Europe, to the peoples of England and the United Providence and these other places. And
Mm-hmm.
so they were simply taking that, right, and simply expounding upon it, or should I say, what's the word? What's the difference between an invention and innovation, if you will? They were kind of, right, taking. They didn't sort of invent these ideas per se, but they innovated it in such a way, uh, in an attempt to expand, if you will, the rights of the Englishmen, expand those rights to the peoples of the English colonies.
Mm.
And so they want to just say, well, let's just get rid of all that, because these are ideas of the, the white man, and so on, and so forth.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what they did. And a lot of it was this kind of a hubris, or this bitterness was imparted, if you will, in the minds, and not just the common folks of these various African countries, but this was, their leadership, their politicians, their demagogues, and what we would call community activists or community organizers.
Mm-hmm.
These same kind of folks were around in these various
Yeah.
African countries in the 1940s, 1950s, and hence the problems that Africa's still having today.
That's that's interesting. Um, you said also in the Malcolm video, when you talk about colonialism, you were saying how the colonialists, they were letting the tribes know, well, they were bringing some order and some structure, because the tribes,
Mhm.
the African tribes, were warring with each other and tearing each other apart. So the colonialists were like, they stepped in, they said, all right, we're going to put our foot down. We're going to settle all of this and give some
Mhm.
order here. And
Yeah.
the tribes, when they were given the opportunity to allow the colonialists to keep the government in place, they wanted to kick them out. And I think
Hmm.
you said, you're basically summarizing and saying, hey, the colonialists were like, listen, all right, if we leave, you guys are going to destroy each other. It's going to be
Yeah.
chaos. Just
Yeah.
know that. And so they
Yeah.
left, and now you got the chaos. And so it goes
Yeah.
back to,
Yeah.
yeah.
And that's the point. And I wanted to make that point when you asked me the previous question that you asked me, is that yes, Great Britain and of course, Germany had colonies in Africa as well, and France and the Dutch and so on. And they were more than willing, because like I said, they knew that it was over. That the days of the European empire, the days of the great European nation state was over. But they said, well, listen, sure, I have no problem with giving you your independence, giving you your freedom, but you have to there has to be a transitional period, right? There has to be a point where you need advisors and all the stuff, right? And, people to kind of oversee the implementation and creation of this new kind of system, right? I mean, hence, look at what happened a couple of years ago with that just. I mean, words can't describe just the tragedy that took place in Afghanistan a couple of years ago. Because you have to understand that societies and civilizations aren't things that just pop up out of nowhere. Uh, white society, the white man's world, right? I mean, we're building upon thousands of years of moral and philosophical development. It doesn't just happen overnight. And said moral and philosophical and spiritual development happens within a very specific geographical context. These things happen within a very specific military context, and so on and so forth. It's not something that people just easily can just pick up. And I think that even here in the West, sometimes we have this sort of naivete or almost like an intellectual self-centeredness where we believe that all we have to do is simply impart into the minds of people the superiority of our ideas, and they will just simply take to them because, of course, the marketplace of ideas would dictate that they embrace these things. But, it doesn't always work out that way. Because people at the same time are still susceptible to vice, and they're also susceptible to negative emotions, right? Hence sin. And so envy and jealousy, power and ambition, these things will always, they will be with us until the
Mhm.
end of time. And so it's not always as easy as it would seem. But to go back to your question, yes, they said, all right, cool, but give it some time. Allow us to kind of slowly hand the baton off to you. And they said, no, we want independence, and we want it now. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that a lot of it was a lot of Soviet propaganda.
Mhm.
Because what the Soviet Union would do is they would take certain peoples and pluck them out. And they would literally, in the instances of, say, I mentioned Patrice Lumumba, man, the current president of the state of Palestine, Mahmoud Abbas, he was trained in the Soviet Union. The late Yasser Arafat, I think he was the first president of the Palestinian Liberation Authority. He was trained at the Stalin Institute. uh,
Mm.
Even Yasser Arafat. I'm going to do a whole video on this thing. That's going to be my next video, just as an aside, because I'm seeing a lot of troubling trends amongst the what I consider to be this neo-populist conservative coalition. We don't
Mm.
know our history, and we haven't learned from the 1930s. There's this growing kind of pacifism I'm seeing amongst a lot of conservatives that really
Mhm.
bother me. I think they got their morals screwed up. But anyway, that's a side note. But in for example, I mean, Yasser Arafat. And I'm gonna get back to your question. Yasser Arafat, one of the kind of marquee things that he did was in 1974. You can go and look at he actually visited Lenin's tomb, if you will, his grave site in 1974, and placed a wreath in commemoration of the life of Vladimir Lenin on his tomb.
Mm.
Because Yasser Arafat was a creation, if you will, of the KGB. They virtually created Yasser Arafat. The Romanian communist dictator Nicolae Ceausescu, he and Yasser Arafat had a conference of sorts in 1978. Well, where Ceausescu told Yasser Arafat, gave him tips and tricks on how to manipulate the Western media, and how to could lie and to convince them that how much you want peace and how to make your enemies seem like the aggressor, how to
Mm.
make people feel sorry for you and how to get their sympathy. And once they let their guards down, that's when you spring into your attack. Again, these are all communist tactics
Yeah.
that the international Muslim Arab liberationist movement, these are the same exact tactics that they employ. And they've been doing it for a very, very long time. It's, of course, culminated, if you can believe this. Many of folk may not remember that Yasser Arafat was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1994.
Mm.
And I don't need to go
So
into the
was Obama.
particulars in terms of, so did Obama. I don't need to go into Yasser Arafat's life, his deeds, and his words for, for folks to realize how much of a farce that is. I say all that to say that it was also Ruhollah Khomeini, the Ayatollah, who in 1974, of course, backed by the Iranian communist movement. Yes, there was an Iranian communist movement that threw out the Shah in 1979. Ruhollah Khomeini was also trained at the and speaking of Patrice Lumumba, they actually named a school after him. And I believe Ruhollah Khomeini was trained and educated at the Patrice Lumumba Institute
Mm-hmm.
in Soviet Russia. And
Yeah.
so the Soviet Union would take certain individuals and pluck them out
Mm.
and bring them in. And then they would go back into their native countries to become these rebel rousers.
That's interesting
And
because,
so,
yeah, dropping a lot today. So, yeah, actually, I had a book by the John Birch Society years ago about it talked about 9/11. It was called The Terror Triangle. And in that book, it was hard for me to grasp, but in that book, he talks about Art Thompson, who wrote it, talks about the connection that some of the terrorists, the Arab terrorists, had with the KGB
KGB,
and
that's right.
communists. And I never understood that. It was crazy.
Starting to understand it now, though, huh?
Yeah. Bringing Malcolm back up again. It's funny that he would promote socialism or Marxism when the Nation of Islam, from my understanding, was actually promoting free market principles and capitalism because, Malcolm talked about doing for self and, kind of building yourself up and profiting or building businesses. And the Nation of Islam teaches those principles. And I remember, like, even my father was in the Nation of Islam. So he said how he used to sell newspapers and he made some good money selling newspapers and bean pies. And then my grandfather told me a while back that I think when he lived in New York, the Nation of Islam was helping Black people become self-sufficient and setting businesses up. And I think you mentioned in your video that Elijah Muhammad was making money, and Malcolm was just so militant. He was like, forget the money. Let's put some of these principles into practice and have a takeover, basically, because this is bigger than money for me.
And because Malcolm was he was a true believer, and what's the point? Because to simply just sit back and do that and the rest on that, well, then you're simply you're just buying into you're buying into the system. You've betrayed the revolution essentially. Once you come to the just imagine how ironic that is when you realize that the system actually works, that you can carve out a decent life, and have enough to raise a family and to do all the things that you need to do. When you realize that the system actually works, and so what you are doing in the mind of someone who's a leftist is you are allowing something that is intrinsically unjust to continue by way of your participation. And the reason why this more superior, if you will, way of living, this superior way of being has not happened yet, it is to the extent that you refuse to join the ranks of the proletariat that we haven't succeeded. And so therein lies the problem, when people start to stress these notions of individualism and whatnot. And individualism as a concept philosophically does not mean being selfish. Does not or individualistic or non-caring and being callous and insensitive to the sufferings of people. That's not what being an individual means, or stressing the concept of individualism. But that's another conversation. But yeah, Malcolm was, he was upsetting the apple cart, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of it you'll hear, like even in with the folks, likes of folks like Claude Anderson and others, and you'll hear a lot of these black activists. They will talk about economic empowerment, and they would say all these things, which would make you think, okay, well, here is someone who is who is in support of the principle of free market economics. This person is about building wealth and so on and so forth. But no, they're playing lip service to it, but they don't, in fact, know how to do it, because many of them, like a Claude Anderson, they stress this whole notion, this whole concept of this kind of collective economics, right? We need to spend with our own and patronize black businesses and start your own business and do all this stuff and do that. But of course, all of that, I mean, it will crumble
Yeah.
underneath the house of cards if it's not built upon a solid moral, i.e., a solid cultural foundation. And when I say a solid cultural foundation, I mean you have to have a prerequisite a prerequisite set of values that strengthen the overall character of the individual. Because no matter what you say about a group cannot exist without singular individuals. So
Mm-hmm.
that is in fact what a group is. It is a collection of individuals, and when you have a collection of individuals all agreeing to carry their own weight,
Mm-hmm.
if you will, well then now you're saying something.
Yeah.
But as long as black folks stress this whole, well, we, there will never be any ascension or transcendence, if you will, uh, uh, out of some sort of predicament. And a lot of this stuff is just pure fallacy,
Yeah.
and just a kind of a lot of over the top make believe sort of stuff. Because there are individual black folks, you and I and others who may do quite well. Even you have a lot of black folks who are extremely liberal, who are doing quite
Mm-hmm.
well. You would know that by how they speak.
Right.
But insofar as blacks continue to harp on the we,
Yeah.
then they will, nothing will ever happen for them the way in which or the group that they consider themselves to belong to. Nothing's
Mm-hmm.
going to happen to their liking, because you cannot put the we before the I. Because if you put the we before the I, the individual who needs to get up off his behind is always going to feel as though he can't do that
Mm-hmm.
until that person
Right.
decides to either do it first or do it at the same time that I'm doing it.
Right.
And if they aren't willing to do it, then why should I do anything?
Yeah.
Because there has to first be a we, but there
Right.
can't be no we without first an I.
Yeah. And another thing that people don't realize is that Hitler was actually a socialist. He believed in national
Mhm.
socialism. And
Right.
so when people talk about right wingers, like I think you mentioned right wingers, being fascists. Well, actually, a lot of right wingers promote capitalism and a free market, so-called right wingers, whatever. And
Right.
they don't remember the fact that Hitler was actually a socialism, and they don't associate Nazism with
Right.
socialism. They don't
Yeah.
associate, it doesn't get a bad rap, but the capitalist and the free market, that gets a negative outlook. Uh,
Right.
Before we wrap up, I don't know how much time you have left, but
I'm chilling. Yeah.
okay, I wanted to touch on some hip hop and I wanted to get into the Black Panthers,
Okay.
because again, when we were listening to hip hop, they would
Yeah.
talk about, we would hear about the Black Panthers, and especially you think about Chuck D and Public Enemy and all these guys, and you hear them promote like Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale and all these guys. And I watched some of your videos on the Black Panthers, and I listened to the interview you had with Sub-Zero. And you said
Mhm.
you were saying that, man, the Black Panthers, some of these guys were just some cold-blooded killers.
Yeah.
Go into that a little bit, because when we think of when a lot of people think of the Black Panthers, especially in the hip hop community, they think that the Black Panthers were just this philanthropic organization that just wanted to help Black people and set up, food drives and feed children and just have peace and self-sufficiency in the Black community. But you're saying that this picture is not accurate.
No, it's
Some
not
of these guys were
accurate.
gangsters, pretty much.
Yeah. I mean, the fact that they recruited, I mean, and that was the especially, I mean, like in California, of course, like the Oakland, San Francisco, Berkeley area. Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton, I mean, their vision was to take the lowest of the low, and politicize them, and they saw themselves as um, the philosophical kings, if you will, the thinkers, the brains behind the brawn, if you will, even though, I mean, even prior to the incident involving Huey P. Newton and the murder of Officer John Fry, Huey P. Newton, I think he had already, I can't remember if he was actually convicted of a misdemeanor for the stabbing of a gentleman before I think he even met Bobby Seale at Merritt in the mid 1960s. Yeah, but Huey P. Newton was, of course, a rough and tumble kid who was known for fighting, sort of being very aggressive. Even Bobby Seale even talked about how, he marveled at, how uh, good of a fighter Huey P. Newton was. Bobby Seale being, the more physically imposing of the two and the better speaker. Is one thing that Huey P. Newton always had an insecurity, if you will, about his voice. If you ever listen to Huey P. Newton speak, he don't sound like Barry White or James Earl Jones by any stretch of the imagination. And so he didn't really like to speak a lot publicly because he just was very insecure about his voice and somewhat probably insecure about his stature. But he was a very voracious fighter. He was just good with his hands. And Bobby Seale was the more polished speaker. Probably, even when it came to the tenets of Marxism, he was probably a better teacher and a better communicator. And so you put those two together, and Bobby Seale would say, "Man, I never wanted to," because there was a situation uh, not far from the Merritt College and Berkeley campuses where they were accosted, and I think they were arrested. They had gotten to a fist fight with a police officer uh, because the police officer was accusing them of being a public nuisance because there was another fellow gentleman that they had knew. I think he attended Merritt College with them as well, if memory serves me correctly. But he was a poet, and he would write these very political poems, these very racially charged poems. And he would, sort of perform these poems at the command of Seale and Newton, right? They all sort of hung together. And this person was reciting these poems on a public street in the presence of a police officer. And I believe they did so to deliberately antagonize this officer. I actually have the poem or whatever, and some of the things that he was saying. I won't read it, but that's how the situation kicked off. And Huey P. Newton actually got into a physical fight with a police officer, and it was from that point on that Bobby Seale said to himself that he would never go anywhere without Huey sort of having his back, because he was just that tough. And so, like I said, from there, they said to themselves, well, we have to take this information and impart it to the peoples on the street who are most affected by these injustices. You see, if if all of these Marxian ideas are the key, to empowerment and the key to improvement. You take it to the peoples, for one, who are most affected, and you also take it to the people who have the grit and the guts, if you will, those that have what it takes in order to persecute this rebellion and this uprising, because it's not going to happen by way of the ballot box. It's going to take place by way of the bullet. Remember that one of Malcolm X's most famous speeches and quotes that he gave was simply this sort of threat to the American system, to say, listen, if you all aren't going to start listening, then we have no other choice but to pick up the gun. It was a famous Malcolm X speech, and
The
somebody may
Ballad of
put
the
it in the
Bullet.
comment section. Yeah, the Ballad of the Bullet. Thank
Mm.
you. And of course, later on, Huey P. Newton and the Black Panther Party was split into two kind of warring factions, the kind of Black Panther Party and the Black Liberation Army. Once Newton was released from prison, he put out this edict, which was, it is time to put down the gun and help the community. And people began to believe that he had sold out the revolution, because the revolution, make no mistake about it, they knew from the time that this all began that it was going to be violent, and they had to do so by way of an armed insurrection. And so, if you're looking for foot soldiers in this socialist revolution, right, you don't go to the country clubs. You don't go. At least this is what their point of view was, and they were borrowing, as I mentioned in that conversation from Sub-Zero, they were borrowing a lot from the literature of Frantz Fanon and Jean-Paul Sartre, who I think, especially Jean-Paul Sartre, did the most in the way of creating the contemporary Black identity, especially with regard to Black masculinity. And so, yes, the Black Panther Party, they recruited gang members, and
Mm.
so you can imagine that these, I mean, they can fawn, I mean, they can play and they can preen and lie about, but at the end of the day, I mean, you're dealing with people who are devoid of high moral character to begin with. And when you teach them that they are the victims of society, this kind of abstraction that we call society, that does nothing in the way of rehabilitating or strengthening their moral character. It just simply makes them more of what they are. And then I can go through individual cases. Like I say, for example, the situation involving Geronimo Pratt. Geronimo Pratt was and I'll just give this because there's a ton of stories, but the one story involving Geronimo Pratt, who's one of the most famous Panthers in the history of their legacy. Of course, he was made famous for the murder of Caroline Olsen. He murdered Caroline Olsen and shot her husband, who survived. Caroline would not. It was a robbery on a Santa Monica tennis court. The story goes that he was upset at the fact that I guess they only had about $30 on them, and so he shot them anyway. And so what eventually happened was Geronimo Pratt was implicated in the murder of Caroline Olsen, thanks to another member of the Black Panther Party, a man by the name of Julius Butler. Now, what ended up resulting in the reversal of Geronimo Pratt's conviction, you have to remember, I think Geronimo Pratt was released from prison in 1997. Johnny Cochran was Geronimo Pratt's lawyer in his case,
Hmm.
in his defense. A lot of people don't know that. Johnny Cochran was this unknown lawyer at the time, but he represented Geronimo Pratt back in the murder, I think, happened in 68, 69. The trial didn't commence until about 2 years later. This was 1971. Cochran remained close with Pratt throughout the decades and vowed that one day he would successfully spring for his release or bring about his release. And it was from that moment that uh, uh, Cochran, it was from that moment, it is said, that Cochran realized that he should have harped on race more. And he said to himself that he would never allow race not to be a major a part of his defense strategy. He took what happened with Geronimo and he played that up over 20 years later in the O.J. Simpson trial. Remember, Geronimo Pratt was released in the wake of the O.J. Simpson trial, which was in the wake of the Rodney King beating, by using what happened to Geronimo Pratt as this kind of de facto class action lawsuit against American racism. And so because the belief was that Julius Butler was a snitch working on behalf of the FBI. But that's not true at all, because Geronimo Pratt was implicated in the murder of Caroline Olsen by way of a letter that was given to a black LAPD sergeant by the name of, I think his name was Dwayne Rice. Julius Butler gave the letter to Sergeant Rice and told him, do not open this letter until, if and when something happens to me in the event of my demise, then you can open up this letter. The feds, in fact, were keeping a close eye on members of the Black Panther Party, Geronimo Pratt, and in particular, because at this point, Geronimo Pratt was the leader of the LA chapter of the Black Panther Party because Bunchy Carter had been murdered just a year earlier. The reason why Julius Butler implicated Pratt in the murder of Caroline Olsen in that letter was because he claimed that he heard Pratt bragging about killing Olsen firsthand, and he knew that the 45 caliber shell casing that was found at the scene belonged to the very same 45 caliber gun that he knew Geronimo Pratt to be the owner of. And not only that, but the car that Geronimo Pratt drove was witnessed at the scene, or leaving the area, or leaving the scene of the crime. Now, follow me. Now, I'm going somewhere with this, because the FBI saw the exchange between Sergeant Rice and Butler and demanded that Butler relinquish the letter. Butler refused. He said, no, my friend gave this to me. He trusts me, and I'm not betraying him. He said, don't open it. I'm not going to open it. It got so bad, the FBI was put so much pressure on Sergeant Rice that he gave the letter to another black police officer, I forget his name, and told him to lock it in a safe. Here's what happened. Sergeant Rice ended up getting into a physical altercation with another officer who just so happened to be white. Now, again, I don't know if this was some kind of FBI plot to get Sergeant Rice into trouble, but there was an internal investigation opened up. There was an internal affairs investigation opened up into the potential, I guess, illegal or nefarious activities of Sergeant Rice, involving his connections primarily with members of the Black Panther Party, most specifically Julius Butler, because I think in the past, Julius Butler had turned over a handgun or something to that effect. Anyway, the FBI kept putting more pressure on Rice until he eventually turned the letter over almost a year and a half after the killing. Now, fast forward to 97, I'm leaving a lot of detail. They claimed that the jury was not made aware that Butler had connections with the FBI during the trial, and as a result, the conviction had to be vacated because that was information that the jury should have known about, but the prosecution left it out of, the trial in 71.
Mm-hmm.
But when Geronimo Pratt's conviction went up for review in 1980, the appellate court rejected it because they had the very same information that the courts knew back in 1971, that Butler gave the letter to Rice and that the FBI didn't know what was in the letter until nearly a year and a half later. If Rice was, in fact, an FBI informant who was sent in to essentially frame Pratt, then why wouldn't Julius Butler hand over his information immediately following the murder, as opposed to putting it in a sealed envelope and giving it to a member of the Los Angeles Police Department? The whole thing was a lie. And the reason why, again, Julius Butler knew very well that Geronimo Pratt was capable of what he heard Geronimo Pratt admit to having done to Caroline Alston, was because he knew that Geronimo Pratt had killed other people, including the second in command, if you will, of the Los Angeles chapter of the Black Panther Party, Bunchy Carter's personal enforcer, a man by the name of Frank Diggs. Also, and it was Geronimo Pratt and another Black Panther, a man by the name, his street name was Blue. His last name was Lewis. I can't remember his first name, but he went by the street name Blue. Both Blue and Geronimo killed Frank Diggs, as well as kidnapped a 17-year-old Panther who they thought was an FBI informant by the name of Ollie Taylor, who Geronimo Pratt kidnapped and forced Julius Butler to pistol whip and interrogate. Julius Butler fled away from the Black Panther Party because he realized how dangerous and destructive they were. And he said, man, I didn't sign on for this. I thought we were here to help the community. And then once Julius Butler began to get soft on the Black Panther Party, which is the key reason why he went to law enforcement, is because Geronimo Pratt had told Butler that he was going to kill him. You see, people think that the Black Panther Party was just promoting all this, or should I say the FBI was just promoting all this disinformation and blah, 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 blah. Nah, man. First of all, COINTELPRO was shut down in 71, and they could say, well, they continued these COINTELPRO tactics, and they did. But my point is that a lot of the information that law enforcement would gather was voluntarily given up to them by people who were former members of the Black Panther Party or current members of the Black Panther Party, who were living in perpetual fear that they would be another victim of the self-imposed internal purges, if you will, that the Black Panther Party would exact and do to their own membership. No different from what other communist regimes do in other countries. They kill their own out of whether it is fear of a rival, someone coming to get their position, whether it's fear that someone is betraying the movement or whatever the case may be. They kill their own. Not to mention the fact that men like Pratt and Huey P. Newton were overwhelmed with paranoia due to their excessive drug use.
Let me
and that's just one story.
Yeah. So that letter that was given to, I think, the cop, right? The letter was given to the police that was talking about Pratt. The cop held on to this letter and didn't release it.
Didn't release it. He didn't give it to the FBI. He was forced to eventually give it over because he couldn't take the pressure anymore. But it went on for a year and a half.
So were the Panthers being protected?
Some of them were, in fact, being protected because they had relationships with people in local law enforcement, because Black Panther Party leadership encouraged it, because, they wanted it to kind of have this semblance that, we are kind of working with law enforcement to try and, reform the police and,
Wow.
their racism and their bigotry, and so you did kind of have these because that was Julius Butler's kind of primary assignment as a party member, was to act as a liaison of sorts to the Los Angeles Police Department. And in the midst of that, he ended up befriending Dwayne Rice.
Yeah.
And then once the crosshairs were put on him, when he thought that he would be Geronimo Pratt's next victim, that's when he ratted him out.
Mm.
But he
And
was never in connection with the FBI prior to that. That is a lie. But Pratt, with the help of Johnny Cochran, being the racial demagogue that he was just a more more well spoken. What do you call it? What's the guy now? Benjamin Crump. He was sort of the Benjamin Crump of his day.
yeah.
He was able to convince the courts that
Mm.
that Pratt's original trial was not in line with the formalities of a standard constitutionally based legal process, and so his conviction was overturned. And remember, this is Tupac Shakur's godfather we're talking about.
I wanted to get into that too. Man, so on one hand, you hear that the black man can't get any justice, and you hear the Panthers basically promoting this idea. But on the other hand, they're working with the system,
Oh, right.
the white supremacist system, law enforcement for protection
Right.
at the same time.
Right.
That
Yeah. And yep. And I'm trying to remember. So yep. You're absolutely right. When Huey P. Newton. When Huey P. Newton murdered Kathleen Smith, she was an 18-year-old young black teenager. She was an 18-year-old prostitute. When he murdered her, remember he fled to Cuba with the help of his primary benefactor, the producer of the film Easy Rider, a man by the name of Robert Schneider. And even whilst in Cuba, he was visited by Hollywood luminaries such as Jack Nicholson and others. Because Huey P. Newton, you had of course Jane Fonda and other leftists in Hollywood, such as the legendary Marlon Brando. They were big time supporters of the Black Panther Party. Just the whole movement in the Black Panther Party was the vanguard, as they would call it, of the neo-communist left. And the neo-communist left came about after the death of Joseph Stalin. When the crimes of Joseph Stalin was made public, the left had to sort of regroup. And this is speaking of colonialism, this is when they really began to embrace this idea that the struggles of African Americans should and must be linked to the struggles of the peoples of the third world. And this is when men like Che Guevara became the primary patron saint, if you will, of the neo-communist left, which of course included the Black Panther Party. So when Huey P. Newton fled, when he went to Cuba, at this particular time, Elaine Brown, I guess she took over as leader of the Black Panther Party, and she was able to command the allegiance of the Black Panther Party because she had at her disposal Huey P. Newton's own personal hit squad as her enforcers, led by a Panther who went by the street name Big Rob, who was about a 6 foot. They say he was about 6'7", like well over 300 pounds. And whilst this was going on, now mind you, Huey P. Newton said that he fled to Cuba during this legal ordeal involving the murder of Kathleen Smith because of a plot that was orchestrated by a group of Oakland city pimps who were trying to orchestrate Huey P. Newton's assassination due to his ongoing extortion of Oakland's pimps there in the city of Oakland. So, and Huey P. Newton was made aware of this murder plot by way of Oakland PD. He had informants working in the Oakland Police Department who told him that they put a contract on you, not the federal government, but gangsters on the street. because the Black Panther Party was extorting them. Why? Because the Black Panther Party had legal protection from the police. And the reason why the Black Panther Party had legal protection was because of the educational sector and the sympathetic left-wing press that gave the wider public the impression that these were oppressed Black men and women who were trying to uplift their community. So everything that the Black Panther Party was confronted with was made to seem as though, particularly as it pertained to law enforcement or aspects of our political system, it was made to seem as though the Black Panther Party were simply victims of political persecution. So because of public perception, law enforcement's hands were tied, and the media, by and large, had their hands tied because they knew of the Black Panther Party's murders, the killings, the drug dealing, the prostitution, the extortion. They knew about it, but they could not report on it out of fear of being labeled a racist. There was one incident. Just in general, particularly white reporters. I'm trying to remember. There was one gentleman. I think I mentioned him in my talk with Sub-Zero, who had an article published.
Can I pause you right there?
Yeah. All right. I'm ready when you are, bro.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. So as I was saying, man, before we took a short break. So you had a lot of media figures, local reporters. I think his name what's his name? I know his last name was Epstein. Was it Edward J. Epstein? But you had some Edward J. Epstein. There was another brave journalist. Yeah, because mind you, these are no conservatives by any stretch of the imagination. You had another brave journalist, a woman by the name of Kate Coleman, who wrote extensively about the Black Panther Party and their crimes. But there were very few people who were even willing to talk about it. And so the Black Panther Party knew that they were protected, and they pretty much had carte blanche when it came to crime. And so because they fashioned themselves as this political organization, as opposed to guys who were just doing crime for the sake of doing crime, they knew that they could extort them. And so that's what they were doing. And so when Huey fled the country, because he didn't want to face prosecution, he sent a hit team after the primary witness. This woman was named Crystal Gray. And a Panther hit team showed up to her apartment and opened fire, but fortunately for Crystal Gray, they shot up the wrong apartment. And the person inside the unit ended up firing shots back. They just so happened to be armed. And in the midst, I believe one Panther was murdered, but I know one Panther in particular, a man by the name of Florence Forbes, was wounded. Once the assassination attempt was botched, Florence Forbes went on the run because, he knew he had information on what actually took place, and, it kind of put him in a tight squeeze. He either had to kind of fork over what he knew as a participant or, face the consequences, because how they say, sometimes you got to tie up loose ends. And he knew the Black Panther Party was more than willing to kill. And so he and another Black Panther, a friend of his who was in the party, someone that he trusted, he met up with him and they attempted to flee together. They went to Las Vegas for whatever reasons, of all places, but they were eventually tracked down in Vegas. I think Florence Forbes, I don't recall his fate off the top of my hand, but I think he escaped, but they caught his friend. His friend was a fellow Panther by the name of Nelson Malloy. Nelson Malloy was shot in the head and left in a shallow grave. But fortunately, he survived and he was discovered by pedestrians. But of course, he lived out the rest of his life in a wheelchair. He was paralyzed from the neck down. Fellow Panther by the name of, look up the story of Nelson Malloy.
Yeah.
Was shot in the head by members of the Black Panther Party and left in a shallow grave in the desert in Las Vegas. They don't talk about him.
Man.
It's the rank and file. You think about the Black Panther Party, you think about Huey P. Newton, Bobby Seale, and Eldridge Cleaver, right? The three kings of the Black, but you don't hear about men like Nelson Malloy.
Yeah. It's so crazy because what you're saying is the Panthers pretty much, they had protection from Hollywood, sympathizing for their cause, protection from law enforcement, protection from academia, So
And yep, and when they came back, Rashad, pause right there. Hold that thought. Whatever you was finna say, I just wanted because I wanted to say this. When Huey came back, eventually he came back, and of course he went to trial. Right, he was found not guilty. Right, okay, but when he came back, the mayor of Berkeley, they threw this ceremony for him, and they awarded him the what was it called, the California or the Berkeley Citizenship Award. He was given an award when he came back. He's indicted for murder. He flees to Cuba, tries to assassinate the key witness, comes back, and you have politicians giving him awards.
That's crazy.
And they say, and all of these men, they all went on to become a part of the whole California the Democrat Party machine in California, from the governor, Jerry Brown, who was a college roommate. The governor of California, former governor of California, Jerry Brown, was the college roommate of one of the top legal counselors for the Black Panther Party, and Elaine Brown. I forget his name, but Elaine Brown's close consigliere and confidant was Governor Jerry Brown's former college roommate. You have Jerry Brown, the governor of California, Willie Brown, who will go on to become as a matter of fact, at the state Democrat convention, Elaine Brown was one of the delegates for the governor, Jerry Brown. She was one of the delegates and was given a seat at the California State Democrat National Convention. After all of these incidents had transpired, it was Elaine Brown's muscle, her political muscle, her street organizing capabilities. It was she who spearheaded the electing the victory of in the election of Oakland's first Black mayor.
Willie Brown.
So make no mistake. Nah, he was the mayor of San Francisco.
Okay.
Oakland's mayor, the first Black mayor of Oakland. I forget his name, but you cannot write the story. And when we look at California today, you cannot write the story of the Democrat Party in California without bringing up the influence of the Black Panther Party. You just can't leave them out.
I mean, so yeah, like I was saying, I mean, protection from academia, protection from Hollywood, protection from law enforcement. Meanwhile, they're crying about white supremacy and racism, but they're being protected from the very system that they're complaining about.
But he knew had a college degree. He had books he published. The New York Times wrote fawning book reviews over his literature. I mean, he just went on and on.
It's crazy.
Just the whole society they were embraced. They were, I mean, the same way kind of we look at them in retrospect. A lot of people who are ignorant. It wasn't like the Black Panther Party was looked down upon by the whole of society back then. But the liberals, just as today, the liberals back in the 60s and 70s, they thought the Black Panther Party they thought these men were heroes.
That's crazy. Man, you guys dispel so much information, so much mainstream information. I'm sure people that watch this are like, hey man, I just been believing the whole lie like for all this time. It's so crazy. You talked about, I think Huey Newton was on crack, and like you said, he had degrees. Yeah. One point that you made in one of your videos about the Panthers, you said that this was the gangstification of politics. And you said some of this gangstification of politics started with the Civil Rights Act. Can you touch on that a little bit?
Well, yeah, man. I was trying to remember, man, to kind of put my finger on it, because you saw a lot of these strong arm tactics, even going way back, man, during the labor movements of the 1920s and 30s. This is how the Communist Party of America, and make no mistake about it, the Communist Party of America was controlled by the Kremlin. They received their dictates and orders from Moscow. But the labor movement and these various unions is where communists began to, that was their incision point into American society. And so you saw a lot of these strong arm like tactics, even going back to, another famous Black American who is like considered by some to be the father, if you will, of the Black Civil Rights Movement, which was A. Philip Randolph. A. Philip Randolph, again, was they consider him to be a labor leader. He is a self-described, or was a self-described socialist, although he was an anti-communist, so the story goes, which is why he left his post as president of the National Negro Congress, which initially commenced, I believe the year was 1936. And this was considered the largest civil rights, as they called it, coalition at the time, and perhaps in history. I mean, they boasted, shoot, man, I want to say with million. I mean, they had so many members. I don't want to misspeak and say millions, but they had a lot. And A. Philip Randolph was at the head of it, and of the, I guess, the governing executive board of the National Negro Congress, you actually did have folks who were card-carrying members of the Communist Party. And so you began to see these kind of strong arm tactics because, A. Philip Randolph, one of the things that, of course, labor unions and their thuggish behavior, especially back then. And it's funny because, when we think about the civil rights movement, we see just the way the police and the dogs, the water hoses, the clubs, but law enforcement would do the exact same thing to a lot of these labor activists as well. When they would strike and do all these sorts of things, businessmen would call in law enforcement to break up these protests, and there was a lot of violent, flat out knockdown, drag out battles on the streets between law enforcement and union employees. So A. Philip Randolph would threaten politicians with various work stoppages, because you have to understand, when you have an entire collective, and this is what kind of collectivism is all about, and this is why socialism is so dangerous, not just economically, but what it does socially or culturally, how it breaks down society, and how it could really bring society to a close when you have millions upon millions of people that are willing to, upon command, act in unison, whilst at the same time preventing anyone else who is willing to work from working out of fear of violent reprisals. And a lot of the civil rights, mind you, someone like a Harry Truman, who was just, I mean, he was prime target number one in terms of the Communist Party. They hated Harry Truman. And you had men like Harry Dexter White and others who were Soviet agents inside of Harry Truman's State Department. A lot of these men were holdovers from the previous administration, which I think it was the deliberate acts of Soviet spies within the State Department that allowed for that allowed for China to fall into the hands of Mao Zedong. And that's a totally different discussion. I bring all that up to say, when you're talking about the gangstification of politics, you began to see a lot of threatening. And then this is like A. Philip Randolph, Baird Rustin, some of these men who were involved with MLK and the civil rights movement. They learned of a lot of these tactics, these kind of threatening tactics when it comes to politicians. And they would say, listen, you do as we say. I need to be able to take something back to my community. I need to be able to take something back to Black people. And if you don't do what I say, then, there are going to be mass scale riots and so on and so forth. And if you retaliate in kind, essentially, then we have ways of making the United States government appear like it is the fascistic, oppressive entity that these left-wing mouthpieces want to make it out to be. And so I think a lot of this gangstification, just to go back even further, could be placed at the feet of A. Philip Randolph. And of course, MLK would go on from there.
Yeah.
So yes, absolutely. When MLK would say such things as, riots are the language of the unheard, or something to that effect, this is what MLK is talking about. He's doing so for the sake of his own vanity, for the sake of his own popularity, his empowerment, and so on. But he's trying to kind of socialize or Sovietize America, especially when it came to the almost irreparable damage that has been done to our Constitution in the way of the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment virtually doesn't even exist anymore. And a lot of that has to do, and if you read the 10th Amendment and go through it with a fine tooth comb, you'll understand how dangerous it is. I'm not saying that the 10th Amendment is the most important amendment. I don't think there is really a such thing as the most. If I had to say, maybe it'd be the first. But what King was able to do, and his whole plan and goal was to again to take the federal government's jurisdiction and expand it, which is in fact, if you go to even Marx's own theories, and you begin to then see where those two things line up, and he did so. He was able to accomplish this by threatening various politicians and other folks that, hey, you see how well polished and well respected and accepted that I am. Hey, deal with me or deal with them, deal with the consequences, deal with the rabble, deal with the riots, and so forth. And from there, once Dr. King became this, I guess, somewhat of a respected figure in American society, that is when he began to up the ante. That is when he began to up the demagogic rhetoric when it came to race, particularly as it pertained to, of course, the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, so when I say gangstification of American politics, this is what I'm really talking about, not just in terms of the strong arm kind of blackmail tactics involving violence and riots and law breaking and other things, but when it comes to particularly the Democrat Party, and its connection with the so-called community organizer. The 60s really marked the beginning of that relationship between the community organizer and the mainstream of Democrat Party politics.
Wow. Um, I got about, I don't know, you could go another 15?
I give you about another 10, 15,
Okay.
man. And
Um,
we wrap it
all
up
right.
and
Cool.
recommence another time.
When
Mhm.
it comes to hip hop, throughout the years, big hip hop heads,
Right.
we
I
talking about
was.
talking about the Black Panthers and Tupac.
Mhm.
And looking back on Tupac's life, and I watched the Dear Mama video. Do you
Mhm.
think, because Tupac had a relationship with the Black Panthers, obviously, do you think that Tupac was Marxist? Do you think he believed in Marxism and socialism?
He did. He did. It's funny, and I don't know how much of this is myth or how much of it is reality. Everyone who knows Tupac always likes to talk about how brilliant, how intelligent he was, and I think that just speaks to the immaturity of the liberal mind, if you will. If you think that someone like Tupac Shakur was brilliant, he was artistically gifted. He was a decent thespian. People talk about how great of an actor he was. I don't think he ever got a chance to really display the full range of his acting chops or what would have become of them. Yes, he was very talented. He's very charismatic. You know what I'm saying? He was a very, very handsome man, what I'm saying? Pause, as the young people say. You know what I'm saying? But he was a man who, as people describe him, especially when you listen to a lot of these old school rappers who are now touring the podcast circuits, they just talk about how magnetic he was when he walked in a room. It was almost, I was listening to recently Fredro Starr of Onyx
Hmm.
give an interview, and he said when he walked in, it was almost like the sun. It was this energy, this heat. You felt him when he came into a room. It was like all eyes on him. I mean, he was a special character. Special for all the wrong reasons in this sense. But I'm not saying that he wasn't talented, and that he wasn't a gifted. and he, may even consider him well spoken. But you can be well spoken and say something extremely stupid, and he would say a lot of stupid things. People just, tended to gush and go about how brilliant he was. And I remember when I read Michael Eric Dyson's biography of Tupac Shakur titled "Holler If You Hear Me." He was actually invited, I believe, to the home of, I think her name was Lisa Steinberg. I think her last name was Steinberg, but she was Tupac Shakur's first talent or manager. And Michael Eric Dyson tells the story of how he was personally shown Tupac's personal book collection. And it goes through all the books that he would read and the literature and all the stuff that he was into. And it makes me wonder, and I say to myself, seriously, I mean, I don't know. Let's just say he was reading all these things. It just goes to show you it's not how much you read, but it's what you read. Right. But yeah, he would read all these things or whatever. And so, yeah, I think, Tupac, make no mistake about it. I mean, I believe he believed in these Marxist ideas. His mother, Feeney, was certainly a Marxist. And when I say she was a Marxist, I mean that she understood what the governing principles of the Black Panther Party was. I mean, she was an OG. She was one of the first, initiated into the Harlem chapter of the Black Panther Party by a man named Lumumba Shakur. And so, yes, was her husband, as they describe Lumumba as being her husband. I don't know how formal, because again, when it comes to these Marxists, they have a very peculiar relationship to traditional family structures, and so it's a bit kind of odd. I don't know if it was an informal marriage or were they actually recognized as husband and wife by the state. I'm not sure. But yes, his mother was certainly a Marxist, and she certainly kind of educated him and taught him in this way. And you can clearly hear the Marxism in his rhetoric from the time, of course, the famous interview with while he was still in high school, and he's speaking about all these ideas that he has about the world. And just what stands out to me with that interview is how he's displaying his displeasure with Ronald Reagan, or his displeasure with the fact that George Herbert Walker Bush had won the election in 1988. Of course, he says that he's not saying that. And I'm paraphrasing Pac. I know many people have probably remembers this interview, have seen it, where he says that he's not saying that George Bush is a bad person. To some people, to somebody out there, to someone somewhere, George Bush is a good person because George Bush is doing what he needs to do for the people who support him. And by that, he meant the rich and the wealthy. And so, conservatives or Republicans are viewed as, and of course, there's a Republican elite, of course, Republicans with money, but there are also liberals with money, Democrats with money. But that's Pac, and he's talking about the rich and the wealthy, and so you will hear laden within Tupac's economic and political critiques these Marxist ideas. His entire economic critique was Marxist in nature, Marxist to its core.
Yeah.
And when you look at the fact that even by the late 80s, I mean, he was a member of the New Africa Panthers in Marin City. I think the story went that there was some type of racial altercation involving a group of skinheads, as they were described, and a group of Black teenagers, I think at a party or something that Tupac had attended. And so I'm going off memory because I've read a lot of biographical information about Tupac from individuals who've done the research and who spoke to people who knew him back then. And that gave him the idea to try and restart the Black Panther Party. But the difference, in Tupac expressed this, and even if you listen to, for example, these stories that Jada Pinkett tells about Tupac, and how a lot of his insecurities stemmed from his extreme poverty as a child, because the poverty that was brought on by his mother's political work, mind you, as member of the New York 21, after The New York 21 was found not guilty. She was like many other Black Panther parties. When you're talking about how the system embraced them, but they're supposed to be so against the system, Afeni Shakur was touring the Ivy League lecture circuit for years. And then once those opportunities dried up, along with her drug addiction, thanks to her connection to a lot of the guys on the street or whatever, you know, Tupac Shakur, he grew up immensely poor. And so he had a lot of insecurities about that. And he was very upset with his mother for that, because in many respects he felt betrayed by her because she had neglected her maternal responsibilities, which, according to Jada Pinkett, is why Tupac was so, I guess, harsh and vitriolic in his critique or attacks against those who he felt as though had betrayed him, because he never got that true sense of loyalty from his mother. He also never got that true sense of loyalty from the peoples around his mother, who he felt as though had left her and subsequently her children behind, when they were supposed to be all about this movement, and they were all supposed to support and come together as this socialist, this kind of Black collective. He felt like they had betrayed her and left her behind, and as a result, he suffered coming up as a child, having to live in immense poverty. So one of the things, the deviations, was when Pac and his mother, Pac couldn't understand this kind of refutation or of adverse reaction or sensibility that the Black Panther Party had towards wealth and profits and money. And so Pac made it a point to say, Pac made it a point to say that, listen, man, if we're going to do this political work, we can't do it if we broke. No, this doesn't make sense to me. That's the one thing that he couldn't understand, is how his mom, and even Afeni even says, and I'm hearkening back to when I would go over, or when I went over, because I read the book more than once. Michael Eric Dyson, when he details the conversation between he and Afeni, because they spoke with one another. Michael Eric Dyson interviewed on multiple occasions Afeni Shakur, and Afeni opens up about how she was indoctrinated into believing that, private property and having wealth and having money and these are things that are supposed to be rejected, because all your property and things of that nature are supposed to go into the movement. And so part of the goal, at least according to some who are quite sympathetic to the cause of the Marxist left, suggests that Tupac, his overall plan, his long-term mission, was to use his wealth and influence to kind of indoctrinate, if you will, street level gang members and thugs. This whole Thug Nation, Thug Life concept was to indoctrinate them into these Marxist ideas. And this was going to be spearheaded by, respected gang members like Monster Cody and others. And when we saw this play out decades earlier, when you began to see the Black Panther Party members try to draw connections with other street gangs in other parts of the world, like, for example, with Fred Hampton in Chicago and the relationship between the Black Panther Party and the Black Stone Rangers. And so a lot of the managers and the lawyers or other folks surrounding Tupac were also activists who had connections with these new upstart Black Panther Party factions. And so with Geronimo Pratt still in prison, and I think Huey P. Newton, who was in prison in the late 80s, shortly before he was released and he was murdered in 1989, Geronimo Pratt and Huey P. Newton had squashed their long ongoing beef, because Geronimo Pratt was under the impression that Elaine Brown was working for the FBI. And it was Elaine Brown who really caused the rift between Pratt and Newton. So the story goes, squashed their beef. You had Mutulu Shakur, right, the biological father of Tupac's sister Sakiwa. You had Mutulu and Geronimo, and a man by the name of Chokwe Lumumba, who was Tupac Shakur's lawyer, and another man by the name of not was it Seiko Odinga, I think was the name of his business manager, if I'm not mistaken. They had this idea of using Tupac's celebrity to create this new Black Panther Party, and the whole slew or contingent of popular rappers were going to be used to promote this idea, like this thug life, this thug nation
Yeah.
concept. This was supposed to be the new incarnation of this sort of Black power, Black militancy that they attempted back in the 1960s.
Yeah. Wow. We might have to do a whole nother episode on that alone. But
Absolutely.
yeah, man, just wrapping up. You definitely got to write a book. I'm gonna be on you about that. As far as hip hop, man,
Oh, my bad. Not Seiko Odinga. Seiko Odinga is another man. Tupac's business manager was a man by the name of Watani Tahemba.
Okay.
Not Seiko Odinga. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Seiko Odinga is another radical. But anyway, go
Yeah.
ahead, wrap up.
Yeah, as far as hip hop, I was a fanatic about it growing up. I used to listen to a lot of artists and became influenced by them. As far as the ideology, somewhat, I would care when I heard KRS-One talk about the Bible. I went and picked up a Bible and started reading books and all this stuff. But looking back, especially with Tupac, he is revered, he's respected in the hip hop community and regarded as one of the best. But when I look at his ideology and how he conducted himself, I do question that a lot, especially towards the end of his life when he put hit him up out. To me, that was beyond a diss track. That was just, it was scathing. It was venomous. I mean, it threw the fuel. It really lit the fire and led to the death of not only himself, but Biggie. And,
depending on who you ask, I mean, that was the whole point, is to get Tupac off of his political path. And that was Death Row's entire their main objective. And then this is coming from the conspiratorial minds of the extreme left, who still try to pass Tupac off as this positive influence, as this great leader, as someone who was struck down by the powers that be. These conspiratorial ideas that Tupac's death was a result of an FBI plot.
Yeah.
The same way in which, for example, like Fred Hampton was assassinated, or like an MLK was assassinated. And so this is why they placed Tupac in that same pantheon.
Yeah.
And, Death Row, that was their, and I think Death Row was a subsidiary of Interscope. And then I guess, Interscope has some ties and some connections to organized crime and the intelligence community and all this, so on and so forth. So there are a lot of sort of grand conspiracies out there about that. And they claim that the Death Row of Bad Boy East Coast West Coast beef was a modern day COINTELPRO operation, is what they claim.
Yeah, I mean, even the Hughes brothers said that. One of them said that I think Jimmy Iovine let him hit him up before he released it, and one of the Hughes brothers said, "Don't put this out because somebody's gonna die over this." And when you listen to the track itself, I mean, he's talking about sleeping with another man's wife. He's saying we have the guns in our staff. I mean, it was just like, you knew someone was getting killed over that song, talking about people with sickle cell and all this.
Right, yeah. That wasn't no battle. That wasn't no battle rap. That's not taking it back to the days of KRS-One and MC Shan.
Absolutely not.
And
wasn't the bridges over.
This ain't Kumo D and Busy B. This is something different.
Yeah, man. And just, looking back on some of the stuff I listened to, I barely listen to hip hop anymore. I'm just listening to instrumentals. But when I look at the ideology that was promoted a lot of the times, especially from Wu-Tang with the basically black supremacy and, even the Ghostface and the RZA supported Hillary Clinton. And I thought it was crazy because you have Wu-Tang, all their careers talking about, kind of New World Order, anti-New World Order, anti-establishment stuff. And then here they go supporting the establishment or, talking about it. So
because of a gross misunderstanding of what conservative philosophy really means, because The left erroneously believes, fallaciously believes that the point of conservatism, even going back to the founding, as I mentioned earlier, the point of it is to protect entrenched power. This is what the left does not understand, right? People rise to power. You can't prevent this, especially when you're talking about certain things, for example, as property rights. Right? There's going to be someone who is wealthy. I disabuse myself of such notions as a wealthy class, so to speak, because everything, it's like the circle of life, right? Wealthy people make investments in the things that common people want, right? Common people don't get off their behinds. Common people don't pay their bills, right? And these kind of multifaceted investment portfolios, they fall by the wayside because these securities aren't worth anything when people like you or I don't pay our mortgages, when we don't pay our bills, when we don't work, there's no retirement funds to invest and so on and so forth. And so without wealthy people, right, or without us, there's no wealthy, but without the wealthy folk, we don't exist either. And so it's like cutting off your nose to spite your face. But when
Yeah.
you hear these people talk about this stuff, and they decry conservatism because they just take the word and they think that we are trying to conserve something that does not change. Milton Friedman said it brilliantly when he wrote a book called the Tyranny of the Status Quo. Conservatism is not about conserving the status quo. It's about conserving those key principles and values that allow for the principle of liberty to go on relatively protected. We're trying to conserve liberty, not the power and the wealth of people who seek to do you harm. And
Right.
not all wealthy and powerful people are seeking to do anyone harm.
Right.
It doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
But when they say these things and they latch on to left-wing politics, they buy into the moral melodrama and the rhetoric of the left because they think conservatism means that we aren't for change. And conservatism, change within the context of conservatism, is the only kind of change that can bring about, again, civility and stability. Because if you change, for example, in the wrong direction, you may very well destroy all that which you have built already,
Right.
to your detriment.
Exactly. Ladies and gentlemen, you got an education today. My boy, Chuck. Teach him Chuck, man. I don't know if you want to plug anything.
Nah, man, just follow me on YouTube, man. Like I said, it's difficult for me to put stuff together, man, because I'm super busy, man. I want to start putting out more content, but yeah, man, you guys check me out, man. And
Definitely.
eventually over time, if my profile and things like that begin to grow, then this can become, a part of my my revenue stream, and that way I can dedicate more time to it. Not I panhandling. I do this for free. I don't care. I love Rashad. I love these conversations. I have fun doing
Yeah.
this. But just subscribe to my YouTube channel. Working with Shadow Jackson. We got a documentary we're putting together. Not jointly. I'm just in it. He's really like doing it, but he's doing a documentary on the history of public housing. I'm going to be part of that, and we'll probably start filming for Uncle Tom 3 in the near future, which I plan on being a part of. And of course, the weekly Sunday night show, 7:30 Eastern Time, Chad O. Jackson's YouTube channel, Cutting Through the Culture.
Absolutely,
And that's
man.
it, man.
Thanks for coming on the show today, man. We'll definitely
All right,
be
bro.
in touch, and let's keep it going.
For sure. All right, bro.